Chapters 64 and 65 of Foul Play by Charles Reade and Dion Boucicault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 64. Sir Edward Rolleston could not but feel his obligations to the Wardlaws, and when his daughter got better, he spoke warmly on the subject, and asked her to consider seriously whether she had not tried Arthur's affection sufficiently. "He does not complain to you, I know," said he, "but he feels it very hard that you should punish him for an act of injustice that has already so deeply afflicted him. He says he believes some fool or villain heard him say that £2,000 was to be borrowed between them, and went and imposed on Robert Penfold's credulity; meaning perhaps to call again after the note had been cashed, and get Arthur's share of the money." "But why did he not come forward?" "He declares he did not know when the trial was till a month after; and his father bears him out; says he was actually delirious, and his life in danger. I myself can testify that he was cut down just in this way when he heard the Proserpine was lost, and you on board her. Why not give him credit for the same genuine distress at young Penfold's misfortune? Come, Helen, is it fair to afflict and punish this gentleman for the misfortune of another, whom he never speaks of but with affection and pity? He says that if you would marry him at once, he thinks he should feel strong enough to throw himself into the case with you, and would spare neither money nor labor to clear Robert Penfold; but as it is, he says he feels so wretched and so tortured with jealousy that he can't cooperate warmly with you, though his conscience reproaches him every day. Poor young man! His is really a very hard case. For you promised him your hand before you ever saw Robert Penfold." "I did," said Helen, "but I did not say when. Let me have 1 year to my good work before I devote my whole life to Arthur." "Well, it will be a year wasted. Why postpone your marriage for that?" "I promised." "Yes, but he chose to fancy young Wardlaw as his enemy. You might relax that, now he tells you he will cooperate with you as your husband. Now, Helen, tell the truth. Is it a woman's work? Have you found it so? Will not Arthur do it better than you?" Helen, weakened already by days of suffering, began to cry and say, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" "If you have any doubt, my dear," said Sir Edward, "then think of what I owe to these Wardlaws." And with that he kissed her and left her in tears, and soon after sent Arthur himself up to plead his own cause. It was a fine summer afternoon. The long French casements, looking on the garden of the square, were open, and the balmy air came in and wooed the beautiful girl's cheek and just stirred her hair at times. Arthur Wardlaw came softly in and gazed at her as she lay. Her loveliness filled his heart and soul. He came and knelt by her sofa, and took her hand and kissed it, and his own eyes glistened with tenderness. He had one thing in his favor. He loved her. Her knowledge of this had more than once befriended him, and made her refuse to suspect him of any great ill. It befriended him now. She turned a look of angelic pity on him. "Poor Arthur," she said, "you and I are both unhappy." "But we shall be happy ere long, I hope," said Arthur. Helen shook her head. Then he patted her and coaxed her, and said he would be her servant, as well as a husband, and no wish of her heart should go ungratified. "None," said she, fixing her eyes on him. "Not one," said he, "upon my honor." Then he was so soft and persuasive, and alluded so delicately to her plighted faith, that she felt like a poor bird caught in a silken net. "Sir Edward is very good," said he. "He feels for me." At that moment a note was sent up. "Mr. Wardlaw is here, and has asked me when the marriage is to be. I can't tell him. I look like a fool." Helen sighed deeply, and had begun to gather those tears that weaken a woman. She glanced despairingly to and fro, and saw no escape. Then, heaven knows why or wherefore, probably with no clear design at all but a woman's weak desire to cause a momentary diversion, to put off the inevitable for 5 minutes, she said to Arthur, "Please give me that prayer book. Thank you. It is right you should know this. and she put Cooper's deposition and Welch's into his hands. He devoured them, and started up in great indignation. "It is an abominable slander," said he. "We have lost £10,000 by the wreck of that ship, and Wiley's life was saved by a miracle as well as your own. It is a foul slander. I hurl it from me." And he made his words good by whirling the prayer book out of the window. Helen uttered a scream. "My mother's prayer book!" she cried. "Oh, I beg pardon," said he. "As well you may," said she. "Run and send George after it." "No, I'll go myself," said he. "Pray forgive me. You don't know what a terrible slander they have desecrated your prayer book with." He ran out and was a long time gone. He came back at last, looking terrified. "I can't find it," said he. "Somebody has carried it off. Oh, how unfortunate I am!" "Not find it!" said Helen. "But it must be found." "Of course it must be found," said Arthur. "A pretty scandal to go into the hands of heaven knows who. I shall offer 20 guineas reward for it at once. I'll go down to the Times this moment. Was ever anything so unlucky?" "Yes, go at once," said Helen. "And I'll send the servants into the square. I don't want to say anything unkind, Arthur, but you ought not to have thrown my prayer book into the public street." "I know I ought not. I am ashamed of it myself." "Well, let me see the advertisement." "You shall. I have no doubt we shall recover it." Next morning the Times contained an advertisement offering 20 guineas for a prayer book lost in Hanover Square, and valuable not in itself, but as a relic of a deceased parent. In the afternoon Arthur called to know if anybody had brought the prayer book back. Helen shook her head sadly, and said, "No." He seemed very sorry and so penitent that Helen said, "Do not despair, and if it is gone, why, I must remember you have forgiven me something, and I must forgive you." The footman came in. "If you please, miss, here is a woman wishes to speak to you. Says she has brought a prayer book." "Oh, show her up at once," cried Helen. Arthur turned away his head to hide a cynical smile. He had good reason for thinking it was not the one he had flung out of the window yesterday. A tall woman came in, wearing a thick veil that concealed her features. She entered on her business at once. "You lost a prayer book in this square yesterday, madam?" "Yes." "You offer 20 guineas reward for it?" "Yes." "Please to look at this one." Helen examined it, and said with joy it was hers. Arthur was thunderstruck. He could not believe his senses. "Let me look at it," said he. His eyes went at once to the writing. He turned as pale as death, and stood petrified. The woman took the prayer book out of his unresisting hand, and said, "You'll excuse me, sir, but it is a large reward, and gentlefolks sometimes go from their word when the article is found." Helen, who was delighted at getting back her book, and rather tickled at Arthur having to pay 20 guineas for losing it, burst out laughing, and said, "Give her the reward, Arthur. I am not going to pay for your misdeeds." "With all my heart," said Arthur, struggling for composure. He sat down to draw a cheque. "What name shall I put?" "Edith Heskett." "2 T's?" "No, only one." "There." "Thank you, sir." She put the cheque into her purse, and brought the prayer book to Helen. "Lock it up at once," said she, in a voice so low that Arthur heard her murmur, but not the words. And she retired, leaving Helen staring with amazement, and Arthur in a cold perspiration. 65. When the Springbok weighed anchor and left the island, a solitary form was seen on Telegraph Hill. When she passed eastward out of sight of that point, a solitary figure was seen on the cliffs. When her course brought the island dead astern of her, a solitary figure stood on the east bluff of the island, and was the last object seen from the boat as she left those waters forever. What words can tell the sickening sorrow and utter desolation that possessed that yearning bosom? When the boat had carried Helen away was out of sight, he came back with uneven steps to the cave, and looked at all the familiar objects with stony eyes, and scarce recognized them, for the sunshine of her presence was there no more. He wandered to and fro in a heavy stupor, broken every now and then by sharp pangs of agony that almost made him scream. And so the poor bereaved creature wandered about all day. He could not eat, he could not sleep, his misery was more than he could bear. One day of desolation succeeded another. And what men say so hastily was true for once. His life was a burden. He dragged it about with him, he scarce knew how. He began to hate all the things he had loved while she was there. The beautiful cave, all glorious with pearl, that he had made for her, he could not enter it, the sight killed him, and she not there. He left Paradise Bay altogether at last, and anchored his boat in a nook of Seal Bay. And there he slept in general. But sometimes he would lie down, wherever he happened to be, and sleep as long as he could. To him, to wake was a calamity, and when he did wake, it was always with a dire sense of reviving misery, and a deep sigh at the dark day he knew awaited him. His flesh wasted on his bones, and his clothes hung loosely about him. The sorrow of the mind reduced him almost to that miserable condition in which he had landed on the island. The dog and the seal were faithful to him, used to lie beside him, and often whimpered. Their minds, accustomed to communicate without the aid of speech, found out, heaven knows how, that he was in grief or in sickness. These two creatures, perhaps, saved his life or his reason. They came between his bereaved heart and utter solitude. Thus passed a month of wretchedness unspeakable. Then his grief took a less sullen form. He came back to Paradise Bay, and at sight of it burst into a passion of weeping. These were his first tears, and inaugurated a grief more tender than ever, but less akin to madness and despair. Now he used to go about and cry her name aloud, passionately, by night and day. "Oh, Helen! Helen!" And next his mind changed in one respect, and he clung to every reminiscence of her. Every morning he went round her haunts, and kissed every place where he had seen her put her hand. Only the cave he could not yet face. He tried, too. He went to the mouth of it again and again, and looked in; but go into it and face it, empty of her, he could not. He prayed often. One night he saw her in a dream. She bent a look of angelic pity on him, and said but these words, "Live in my cave," then vanished. Alone on an island in the vast Pacific, who can escape superstition? It fills the air. He took this communication as a command, and the next night he slept in the cave. But he entered it in the dark and left it before dawn. By degrees, however, he plucked up courage and faced it in daylight. But it was a sad trial. He came out crying bitterly after a few minutes. Still he persevered, because her image had bade him; and at last one evening he even lighted the lamp, and sat there looking at the glorious walls and roof his hapless love had made. Getting stronger by degrees, he searched about, and found little relics of her, a glove, a needle, a great hat she had made out of some large leaves. All these he wept over and cherished. But one day he found at the very back of the cave a relic that made him start as if a viper had stung his loving heart. It was a letter. He knew it in a moment. It had already caused him many a pang, but now it almost drove him mad. Arthur Wardlaw's letter! He recoiled from it, and let it lie. He went out of the cave and cursed his hard fate. But he came back. It was one of those horrible things a man abhors yet cannot keep away from. He took it up and dashed it down with rage many times; but it all ended in his lighting the lamp at night, and torturing himself with every word of that loving letter. And she was going home to the writer of that letter, and he was left prisoner on the island. He cursed his generous folly, and writhed in agony at the thought. He raged with jealousy, so that his very grief was blunted for a time. He felt as if he must go mad. Then he prayed fervently; and at last, worn out with such fierce and contending emotions, He fell into a deep sleep, and did not wake till the sun was high in heaven. He woke, and the first thing he saw was the fatal letter lying at his feet in a narrow stream of sunshine that came peering in. He eyed it with horror. This, then, was to haunt him by night and day. He eyed it, then turned his face from it, but could not help eyeing it again. And at last certain words in this letter seemed to him to bear an affinity to another piece of writing that had also cost him a great woe. Memory by its subtle links connected these two enemies of his together. He eyed it still more keenly, and that impression became strengthened. He took the letter and looked at it close, and held it at arm's length, and devoured it. And the effect of this keen examination was very remarkable. It seemed to restore the man to energy and to something like hope. His eyes sparkled, and a triumphant "Ah!" burst from his bosom. He became once more a man of action. He rose and bathed, and walked rapidly to and fro upon the sands, working himself up to a daring enterprise. He took his saw into the jungle, and cut down a tree of a kind common enough there. It was wonderfully soft, and almost as light as cork. The wood of this was literally useless for any other purpose than that to which Penfold destined it. He cut a great many blocks of this wood, and drilled holes in them, and having hundreds of yards of good line, attached these quasi corks to the gunwale, so as to make a lifeboat. This work took him several days, during which time an event occurred that encouraged him. One morning he saw about 1,000,000 birds very busy in the bay, and it proved to be a spermaceti whale come ashore. He went out to her directly with all his tools, for he wanted oil for his enterprise, and the seal oil was exhausted. When he got near the whale in his boat, he observed a harpoon sticking in the animal's back. He cut steps with his axe in the slippery carcass, and got up to it as well as he could, extracted it by cutting and pulling, and threw it down into his boat, but not till he had taken the precaution to stick a great piece of blubber on the barbed point. He then sawed and hacked under difficulties, being buffeted and bothered with thousands of birds so eager for slices, that it was as much as he could do to avoid the making of minced fowl; but, true to his gentle creed, he contrived to get 300 weight of blubber without downright killing any of these greedy competitors, though he buffeted some of them, and nearly knocked out what little sense they had. He came ashore with his blubber and harpoon, and when he came to examine the latter, he found that the name of the owner was cut deeply in the steel: Josh full o' love, J. Fernandez. This inscription had a great effect on Robert Penfold's mind. It seemed to bring the island of Juan Fernandez and humanity in general nearer to him. He boiled down the blubber, and put a barrel of oil on board his lifeboat. He had a ship's lantern to burn it in. He also pitched her bottom as far as he could get at it, and provisioned her for a long voyage, taking care to lash the water cask and beef cask to the forethwart and foremast in case of rough weather. When he had done all this, it occurred to him suddenly that, should he ever escape the winds and waves and get to England, he would then have to encounter difficulties and dangers of another class, and lose the battle by his poverty. "I play my stake now," said he. "I will throw no chance away." He reflected with great bitterness on the misery that want of money had already brought on him; and he vowed to reach England rich, or go to the bottom of the Pacific. This may seem a strange vow for a man to make on an unknown island; but Robert Penfold had a powerful understanding, sharpened by adversity, and his judgment told him truly that he possessed wealth on this island, both directly and indirectly. In the first place, knowledge is sometimes wealth, and the knowledge of this island was a thing he could sell to the American merchants on the coast of Chili, and with this view he put on board his boat specimens of the cassia and other woods, fruit, spices, pitch, guano, pink and red coral, pearl oysters, shells, cochineal, quartz, cotton, etc., etc. Then he took his chisel and struck all the larger pearls off the shells that lined Helen's cave. The walls and roof yielded 9 enormous pearls, 30 large ones, and a great many of the usual size. He made a pocket inside his waistcoat to hold the pearls safe. Then he took his spade and dug into the Spanish ship for treasure. But this was terrible work. The sand returned upon the spade and trebled his labor. The condition to which time and long submersion had reduced this ship and cargo was truly remarkable. Nothing to be seen of the deck but a thin brown streak that mingled with the sand in patches. Of the timbers nothing but the uprights, and of those the larger half eaten and dissolved. He dug 5 days and found nothing solid. On the 6th, being now at the bottom of the ship, he struck his spade against something hard and heavy. On inspection it looked like ore, but of what metal he could not tell. It was as black as a coal. He threw this on one side and found nothing more. But the next day he turned up a smaller fragment, which he took home and cleaned with lime juice. It came out bright in places like silver. This discovery threw light on the other. The piece of black ore, weighing about 7 pounds, was in reality silver coin, that a century of submersion had reduced to the very appearance it wore before it ever went into the furnace. He dug with fresh energy on this discovery, but found nothing more in the ship that day. Then it occurred to him to carry off a few hundredweight of pink coral. He got some fine specimens, and while he was at that work, he fell in with a piece that looked very solid at the root and unnaturally heavy. On a nearer examination this proved to be a foreign substance encrusted with coral. It had twined and twisted and curled over the thing in a most unheard of way. Robert took it home, and by rubbing here and there with lemon juice, at last satisfied himself that this object was a silver box about the size of an octavo volume. It had no keyhole, had evidently been soldered up for greater security, and Robert was left to conjecture how it had come there. He connected it at once with the ship, and felt assured that some attempt had been made to save it. There it had lain by the side of the vessel all these years, but, falling clear of the sand, had been embraced by the growing coral, and was now a curiosity, if not a treasure. He would not break the coral, but put it on board his lifeboat just as it was. And now he dug no more. He thought he could sell the galleon as well as the island by sample, and he was impatient to be gone. He reproached himself, a little unjustly, for allowing a woman to undertake the task of clearing him. "To what annoyances and perhaps affronts have I exposed her?" said he. "No, it is a man's business to defend, not to be defended." To conclude, at high tide one fine afternoon he went on board with Ponto, and hoisting his foresail only, crossed the bay, ranging along the island till he reached the bluff. He got under this, and by means of his compass and previous observations set the boat's head exactly on the line the ducks used to take. Then he set his mainsail to, and stretched boldly out across the great Pacific Ocean. Time seems to wear out everything, even bad luck. It ran strong against Robert Penfold for years; but when it had struck its worst blow, and parted him and Helen Wollaston, it relaxed, and a tide of good luck set in, which, unfortunately, the broken-hearted man could not appreciate at the time. However, so it was. He wanted oil, and a whale came ashore. He wanted treasure, and the sea gave him a little back of all it had swallowed. And now he wanted fine weather, and the ocean for days and nights was like peach-colored glass, dimpled here and there, and soft westerly airs fanned him along by night and day. To be sure he was on the true Pacific Ocean, at a period when it is really free from storms. Still, even for that latitude he had wonderful weather for 6 days; and on the 7th he fell in with a schooner, the skipper and crew of which looked over the bulwarks at him with wonder and cordiality, and casting out a rope astern took him in tow. The skipper had been eyeing him with amazement for some hours through his telescope, but he was a man that had seen a great many strange things, and it was also a point of honor with him never to allow that he was astonished, or taken by surprise, or greatly moved. "Wall, stranger," said he, "what craft is that?" "The Helen." "Where d'ye hail from? Not that I'm curious." "From an unknown island." "Do tell. What, another? Is it anyways nigh?" "Not within 700 miles." "Jerusalem! Have you sailed all that in a cockle shell?" "Yes." "Why, what are ye? The Wandering Jew afloat, or the Ancient Mariner, or only a kinder Nautilus?" "I'm a landsman." A landsman? Then so is Neptune. What is your name when you are ashore?" "Robert Penfold. The Reverend Robert Penfold." "The Reverend? Jerusalem!" "May I ask what is your name, sir?" "Wal, I reckon you may, stranger. I'm Joshua Fullalove from the States, at present located on the island of Juan Fernandez." "Joshua Fullalove? That is lucky. I've got something that belongs to you." He looked about and found the harpoon, and handed it up in a mighty straightforward, simple way. Joshua stared at him incredulously at first, but afterward with amazement. He handled the harpoon, and inquired where Robert had fallen in with it. Robert told him. "You're an honest man," said Fullalove. "You air. Come aboard." He was then pleased to congratulate himself on his strange luck in having drifted across an honest man in the middle of the ocean. "I've heerd," said he, "of an old chap as groped about all his life with a lantern, and couldn't find one. Let's liquor." He had some celestial mixture or other made, including rum, mint, and snow from the Andes, and then began his interrogatories, again disclaiming curiosity at set intervals. "Whither bound, honest man?" "The coast of Chili." "What for?" "Trade." "D'ye buy or sell? Not that it is my business." "I wish to sell." "What's the merchandise?" "Knowledge and treasure." Fullalove scratched his head. "Hain't ye got a few conundrums to swap for gold dust as well?" Robert smiled faintly. "The first time this 6 weeks." "I have to sell the knowledge of an island with rich products, and I have to sell the contents of a Spanish treasure ship that I found buried in the sand of that island." The Yankee's eyes glistened. "Wal," said he, "I do business in islands myself. I've leased this Juan Fernandez. But one of them is enough at a time. I'm monarch of all I survey. But then what I survey is a mixcellaneous bilin of Irish and Otaheitans that it's pison to be monarch of. And now them darned Irish has taken to converting the heathens to superstition and the worship of images, and breaks their heads if they won't. And the heathens are all smiles and sweetness and immorality. No, islands is no bait to me." "I never asked you," said Robert. "What I do ask you is to land me at Valparaiso. There I'll find a purchaser, and will pay you handsomely for your kindness." "That is fair," said Fullalove dryly. "What will you pay me?" "I'll show you," said Robert. He took out of his pocket the smaller conglomeration of Spanish coin, and put it into Fullalove's hand. "That," said he, "is silver coin I dug out of the galleon." Fullalove inspected it keenly, and trembled slightly. Robert then went lightly over the taffrail, and slid down the low rope into his boat. He held up the black mass we have described. "This is solid silver. I will give it you, and my best thanks, to land me at Valparaiso." "Heave it aboard," said the Yankee. Robert steadied himself and hove it on board. The Yankee caught it, heavy as it was, and subjected it to some chemical test directly. "Wal," said he, "that is a bargain. I'll land ye at Valparaiso for this. Jack, lay her head south-southeast and by east." Having given this order, he leaned over the taffrail and asked for more samples. Robert showed him the fruits, woods, and shells, and the pink coral, and bade him observe that the boat was ballasted with pearl oysters. He threw him up one and a bunch of pink coral. He then shinnied up the rope again, and the interrogatories recommenced. But this time he was questioned closely as to who he was, and how he came on the island, and the questions were so shrewd and penetrating that his fortitude gave way, and he cried out in anguish: "Man, man, do not torture me so! Oh, do not make me talk of my grief and my wrongs! They are more than I can bear." Fullalove forbore directly, and offered him a cigar. He took it, and it soothed him a little. It was long since he had smoked one. His agitation subsided, and a quiet tear or two rolled down his haggard cheek. The Yankee saw, and kept silence. But when the cigar was nearly smoked out, he said he was afraid Robert would not find a customer for his island, and what a pity Joshua Fullalove was cool on islands just now. "Oh," said Robert, "I know there are enterprising Americans on the coast who will give me money for what I have to sell." Fullalove was silent a minute. Then he got a piece of wood and a knife, and said with an air of resignation, "I reckon we'll have to deal." Need we say that to deal had been his eager desire from the first? He now began to whittle a peg, and awaited the attack. "What will you give me, sir?" "What, money down? And you got nothing to sell but chances? Why, there's an old cuss about that knows where the island is as well as you do." "Then of course you will treat with him," said Robert, sadly. "Darned if I do," said the Yankee. "You are in trouble, and he is not, nor never will be till he dies, and then he'll get it hot, I calc'late. He is a thief, and stole my harpoon. You are an honest man, and brought it back. I reckon I'll deal with you, and not with that old cuss. Not by a jugful. But it must be on a percentage. You tell me the bearings of that there island, and I'll work it and pay 5% on the gross." "Would you mind throwing that piece of wood into the sea, Mr. Fullalove?" said Robert. "Can't be done, nohow. I can't deal without whittlin'." "You mean you can't take an unfair advantage without it. Come on, Mr. Fullalove, let us cut this short. I am, as you say, an honest and most unfortunate man. Sir, I was falsely accused of a crime and banished my country. I can prove my innocence now, if I can but get home with a great deal of money. So much for me. You are a member of the vainest and most generous nation in the world." "Wal, now that's kind o' honey and vinegar mixed," said Fullalove. "Pretty good for a Britisher, though." "You are a man of that nation which in all the agonies and unparalleled expenses of civil war, smarting, too, under anonymous taunts from England, did yet send over a large sum to relieve the distresses of certain poor Englishmen who were indirect victims of that same calamity. The act, the time, the misery relieved, the taunts overlooked, prove your nation superior to all others in generosity. At least my reading, which is very large, affords no parallel to it, either in ancient or modern history. Mr. Fullalove, please to recollect that you are a member of that nation, and that I am very unhappy and helpless, and want money to undo cruel wrongs, but have no heart to chaffer much. Take the island and the treasures, and give me half the profits you make. Is not that fair?" Fullalove wore a rueful countenance. "Darn the critter," said he. "He'll take skin off my bones if I don't mind. Fust Britisher ever I met as had the sense to see that. 'Twas rather handsome, warn't it? Wal, human nature is deep. Every man you tackle in business larns you something. What with pickin' you out of the sea, and you givin' me back the harpoon the cuss stole, and your face like a young calf, when you are the cutest fox out, and you giving the great United States their due, I'm no more fit to deal than mashed potatoes. Now I cave, it is only for once. Next time don't you try to palaver me. Draw me a map of our island, Britisher, and mark where the Spaniard lies. I tell you I know her name, and the year she was lost in. Learned that at Lima one day. Kinder startled me, you did, when you showed me the coin out of her. Wal, there's my hand on half profits, and if I'm keen I'm squaw." Soon after this he led Robert to his cabin, and Robert drew a large map from his models; and Fullalove, being himself an excellent draughtsman, and provided with proper instruments, aided him to finish it. Next day they sighted Valparaiso, and hove to outside the port. All the specimens of insular wealth were put on board the schooner and secreted; for Fullalove's first move was to get a lease of the island from the Chilian government, and it was no part of his plan to trumpet the article he was going to buy. After a moment's hesitation he declined to take the £7 of silver. He gave as a reason that, having made a bargain which compelled him to go to Valparaiso at once, he did not feel like charging his partner a fancy price for towing his boat thither. At the same time he hinted that, after all this, the next customer would find him a very difficult Yankee to get the better of. With this understanding he gave Robert a draft for £80 on account of profits, and this enabled him to take a passage for England with all his belongings. He arrived at Southampton very soon after the events last related, and thence went to London, fully alive to the danger of his position. He had a friend in his long beard, but he dared not rely on that alone. Like a mole, he worked at night. End of chapter 64 and 65.